Okay, that is, I guess, is my sign. Good morning to everyone. Thank you for coming to our penultimate session on constellations of the ordinary. Welcome to all of you again. It's nice to see you. Last month we had our celebration of Stanley's life. We had a beautiful video and a little bit of an advance on the new posthumous volume of essays that are being published from Stanley. This session we have Gordon Bearn, who's going to be talking about his paper on Beyond the Ordinary. Gordon is professor and chair of philosophy at Lehigh University. He's published on Nietzsche and Wittgenstein a wonderful book called Waking to Wonder, Wittgenstein's Existential Investigations from 1997. And then a book on making life beautiful called Life Drawing, a Deleuzian Aesthetics of Existence from 2014, and articles on Cavell, Derrida, Deleuze, Foucault, and Arakawa and Madeleine Gins. His most recent writing is on Whitman and Cavell, on Wittgenstein's philosophy as a spiritual practice in the lineage of Hadot and Foucault, and a brief, more lyrical meditation sketching a pedagogy of things. He hopes to put these thoughts together into a book moving beyond Wittgenstein in a Foucauldian direction under the tentative title of Inklings in Algebra, a prelude to philosophical thinking. So, Gordon, you have the floor. Welcome.
Thank you, Victor. It's great to be here. I'll just read my paper now. It takes just under 35 minutes, maybe a little over. And there's one slide, and Victor, I'll just call for the slide when I need it and say that's perfect. Okay. I can never tell whether I am moving beyond Cavell's ordinary or not. From my very first acquaintance, something in me resisted his philosophical voice, its conviction. That is not unusual, of course. There are legions of those who resist. What I have found, though, is that the target of my resistance was often an artifact of my own unaffectionate reading. And so, as often as not, my resistance melted into my being carried along by strains of Cavell's writing, strains recently resisted. You will see the same thing happening here, melting resistance. So I will begin with an image of my quandary. It is an early measurement piece by the US-American artist Mel Bachner. It is from 1968, and it is called 8.5 by 11 inches. Could we see it now?
Patricio, la diapositiva, por favor.
Okay, professor.
There's the work of art, if that's not presumptuous. It's an actual sheet of 8.5 by 11 paper. I assume it is a sheet of what was then called typing paper, and typed more or less in the middle of that sheet of paper are the measurements 8.5 by 11 inches. In something like a reversal of Magritte's pipe, this piece first strikes us as on the side of truth, even seeming a tautology. Perhaps in Cavellian terms, it means what it says with total intelligibility. But then, slowly, the piece leans over to the side of falsity, not only because fans of precision will insist that the sheet of paper is not precisely 8.5 by 11 inches, but also because there is so much more to the sheet than simply its dimensions, even were they perfectly accurate. I think we can lose the slide now, Victor.
Okay, Patricio, suficiente, gracias.
Thanks a lot. This phenomenon is quite general. In the Arboretum, there is a tree rising from a pool of gold. 14 feet up, pounded into the trunk, there is a little sign on which we can read Ginkgo biloba. It's a violent scene, and we know who's in charge. The Word. The disempowering name, like Rumpelstiltskin. All those golden leaves pooling on the ground, the trunk's stubby little stems still flecked with gold, are all at once collapsed into this official biological category, Ginkgo biloba. And this singular tree, A green fern still eking out life in the dark shallow between divided limbs. What of it? The singular tree has disappeared behind the botanical type of which it is an instance. There is indeed a primacy of the word, of what is said, but it is not complete. The tree resists, and although at first it can seem that the little label nailed to its flank will silence the singular song of the tree, it can still be heard, resisting the label. Move closer. As the tree takes over one's eyes, making identification impossible, it is the words which, for a spell, dissolve. In spite of the priority of what is said, there is always resistance. Resistance of things, resistance of words. It is a struggle, and in both directions, resistance. It puts one in mind of hateful speech. The relevance of this image to Cavell is this. One aspect of Cavell's ordinary is an ideal of what the world viewed called total intelligibility, a poetry of prose where the time of saying and the time of meaning are perfectly synchronized. Is this ideal realized in Bauchner's 8.5 by 11 inches? Or is it defeated by that sheet of typing paper? That is my quandary. And it works both directions. As things can resist words, so words can resist their systematicity. Grammar is a manner of speaking. The attraction of the appeal to the ordinary is its magic. The magic of managing to accomplish, without metaphysics, every task the other philosophers thought could only be accomplished by means of metaphysical invention. The space between things and words is made for metaphysical invention. It is a realm well trodden by angels. The sentence about the cat can seem too separate from the cat on the mat to secure its truth. And so philosophers invent various third things whose essential defining condition is that they bridge the space between words and things. But does this work? Of course, such inventions work. They were defined as working, but it is too perfect, a cause not for celebration, but for suspicion. A sentence of some human language is disappointing, so philosophers invent a super sentence, the proposition, but we never ask why this proposition proposes just this situation. To be the solution it was invented to be, it had to propose that situation, and that is how philosophy solves its problems, by definition. The beating heart of ordinary language philosophy is the astonishing discovery that if we reject any such third thing, abstaining from all metaphysical invention, then, simply by trusting what is near and unremarkable, our lives with words and things will be transfigured. As Wittgenstein wrote, the general concept of the meaning of a word surrounds the working of language with a haze which makes clear vision impossible. Will clear vision return if we restrict ourselves simply to things and words? That is the appeal of the ordinary, closing the gap between words and things simply by attending to what we say and mean. It is magical, dazing. While I share an attraction to the magically perfect, my resistance flows from an affection for the beautifully irregular, for singular words and singular things overwhelming the imperative to identify and articulate, floating sensual in liquid corporeality. The problem is, I can never quite tell whether this moves me beyond Cavell's ordinary or closer. Let's begin. I'm going to begin by skipping over a section where I suggest that Cavell's dissertation and such an essay as Knowing and Acknowledging is a Clarke-inspired modulation of Austin's Ordinary. Where Austin had appealed to what we say and mean to silence skeptical doubt, Clarke showed that what we say and mean can be used just as well for skeptical as for anti-skeptical purposes. Cavell says as much in the acknowledgments to the book, Must We Mean What We Say? In the 1980s, describing the results of his dissertation, Cavell remarked, I concluded that the argument between the skeptic and the anti-skeptic had no satisfactory conclusion, or that I would search for none. This left me at a place I called nowhere. That was Cavell. But this Clarke-inspired ordinary, a seesaw rocking between skepticism and anti-skepticism would not remain Cavell's ordinary for very long. When he returned to his dissertation, hoping to form it into a book, he seems to have been surprised to discover that he had already moved beyond that nowhere. He writes, "By then I had also completed the drafts of the manuscripts to be published as The World Viewed and The Senses of Walden, and the conclusions so far achieved in the dissertation revision seemed to be outstripped by those pieces." How did those two books outstrip his dissertation? The World Viewed comes to a close by discussing the phenomenon, only available after movies started talking, of the possibility that what we see, what was seen, and what was said were out of sync. Cavell explains. With talkies, we got back the clumsiness of speech, the dumbness and duplicities and concealments of assertion, the bafflement of the soul and body by their inarticulateness. Cavell further describes the crack between the seen and the said in some astonishing lines. These: I have in mind the pulsing air of incommunicability, which may nudge the edge of any experience and placement. The curve of fingers that day, a mouth. The sudden rise of the body's frame as it is caught by the color and scent of flowers. Laughing all afternoon, mostly about nothing. The friend gone, but somewhere now, which starts from here. These lines remind me of Buckner's 8.5 by 11 inches and the ginkgo, both of which I cherish. But Cavell dreams of more, of overcoming the pulsing air of incommunicability. He writes, out of my obscurity, I reach a wish for total intelligibility, as though my words should form for you, but remain part of our breaths, as though poetry were lodged in every cave of memory and locked in every object of thought. Not alone the poetry of poetry, but the poetry of prose, whenever the time of saying and the time of meaning are synchronized. The pulsing air of incommunicability is to give way to total intelligibility, but how? By acknowledging silence, a positive silence deeper than words or things. Cavell calls it the ground of consciousness upon which I cannot but move. What is that ground upon which we cannot but move? That ground which escapes, if only for a moment, the pulsing air of incommunicability. Eyes closed, they are shut. Cavell approaches this question of total intelligibility from the side of actions and words. Here's action. To satisfy the wish to act without performing, to let our actions go out of our hands, we must be willing to allow the self to exhibit itself without the self's intervention. The wish for total intelligibility is a terrible one. It means that we are willing to reveal ourselves through the self's betrayal of itself. The acknowledgement of the possibility of asynchronization is to be accomplished by giving up the effort to achieve synchronization. It is accomplished by acting without performing. In this defeat of the theatrical, some will remember Lao Tzu or maybe Emerson when he tells us that self-reliance, although without ground and so having the grammar of whim, is in the end not whimsical, but fatal. For Emerson, but we shall see not really for Cavell, this fate is our connection by means of utter simplicity to the divine spirit, the ever-blessed one, by which all things are made sacred, the meal in the firkin, the milk in the pan, the blade of grass. But what is the grass? For Cavell, all things can also come to seem sacred, but without the ever-blessed one. In a brief dialogue that concludes in an essay on Emerson, Cavell writes, it is true that when I hear Emerson saying in Self-Reliance, we lie in the lap of an immense intelligence which makes us the receivers of its truth and organs of its activity, I know that while others will take this intelligence to be an allusion to God or the oversoul and a little condescend to it. I, that is Cavell, take it as an allusion to or fantasy of our shared language, and I aspire to descend to it. I can almost hear Cavell saying that the ground of consciousness on which we cannot but move is nothing identifiable, not this ground or that. It is rather our shared language. The trajectory beyond his nowhere takes off from here. It cannot but take off from here, and it will only do so if we don't interfere, but let it move. This moving modulation of nowhere's fulcrum in the human, this fantasy of our shared language, suggests that just as we can act without performing, so we can let our words speak for themselves without our intervening. In the first chapter of Senses of Walden called Words, we learned that Thoreau aspired to write a heroic book in which Cavell says, every word the writer uses will be written so as to acknowledge its own maturity, so as to let it speak for itself, and in a way that holds out its experience to us, allows us to experience it, and allows it to tell us all it knows. Each it in that sentence refers to a word the writer uses, any word. So for instance, the word blue or the word grass. Each time the writer writes the word grass, the writer will step aside so as to acknowledge the maturity of the word grass itself. What is the maturity of a word? Could it be the hundreds of years the word grass has appeared in linguistic life? Then, whenever the word grass appears today, it will bring into the present, or ought to, all of its past appearances, like a movie star. A strikingly similar inheritance of words shows up in a radio talk called Craftsmanship given by Virginia Woolf. Here she is. Words, English words, are full of echoes, of memories, of associations, naturally. They have been out and about, on people's lips, in their houses, in the streets, in the fields for so many centuries. And that is one of the chief difficulties in writing them today, that they are so stored with meanings, with memories, that they have contracted so many marriages. The chief difficulty for Woolf is that our words are so stored with meanings and memories that it is very difficult to use them in new ways so that they tell the truth and create beauty. Cavell is not as interested in novelty as Woolf. He is more interested in total faithfulness to the maturity of every single word. And sometimes I think that might be the real reason I feel drawn to move beyond even this ordinary. Cavell wants the heroic writer to acknowledge the maturity of the word grass, and thus to allow us to know all the word grass already knows. What kind of knowledge does the word grass know? It is not knowledge based on evidence. It is less discreet than that, more all over, like the feel of creek water cooling hot feet. And how do we acknowledge and enjoy all those experiences of the word grass? Cavell says the word should not be employed by us. It should be let loose to speak for itself. In this way, we can hope to allow what we say to enjoy the utterly specific meaning, which is the breaking wave of the word grass on the beaches of the present. We mean what we say when, freeing the words from our control, we let each of them in their maturity speak to that together. Thus we achieve total intelligibility. Remember that brief concluding dialogue I cited? Here is how it really concludes. Found for philosophy, I clap my hands in infantine joy, risking infantilization, leaping free of enforced speech, succeeding it. Thus is philosophy successful. Leaping free of enforced speech, each word speaking for itself. Two directions were important to Wittgenstein's mature work: returning home and going on. Both returning from the slippery ice of metaphysics, and continuing peacefully on, not stymied by scruples. In the conclusion of this dialogue, Cavell seems to describe moving both directions at the same time, synchronized. Returning home by going on in a way that acknowledges the maturity of each word. By going on, by succeeding, thus is philosophy successful. No longer Austin's, not even his first Clarke-inspired nowhere. This is Cavell's own ordinary, and Cavell's ordinary is a musical ordinary. In his late writings, at some distance from the goldfinch and the green jar, Cavell's ordinary became an interpretation of Wittgenstein's suggestion that understanding a sentence is much more akin to understanding a theme in music than one may think. Cavell's idea is that while we are tempted to ground sentential understanding in the individual meanings associated with each word, we have no such temptation when understanding a theme in music. Thus, musical understanding holds out what he calls, quote, the promise of an understanding without meanings, a utopian glimpse of a new or undiscovered relation to language, to its sources in the world, to its means of expression. Cavell's is a musical ordinary. Cavell's ordinary recognizes language's musicality, a generous musicality that of course includes tones of voice, ascending or descending intonations of a phrase, but includes much else besides. In music, it is not true that any C sharp is the same as any other. It depends what type of instrument the C sharp is played on, even which specific instrument of that type is playing it. It depends on the notes before, during, and after its appearance, which will show what key it appears in, or if it appears in any key. It depends on its volume, on whether it is played for a barely noticeable time, for an entire minute, or even longer. Any difference at all may make a difference. The relevant differences are incalculable. Of course, for some purposes, we may not care about those differences. So for some purposes, we might be happy to speak simply of C sharp, but that doesn't mean the differences aren't there and are not significant. We don't care about everything at every time. Our interests change. We even tire. And what is true of the note C sharp is also true of the word grass. The calculable grammar of words in our linguistic life lives on the energy of their incalculable music. Mostly attending to their grammar, we can become deaf to their music, but not Cavell. And in his own readings of movies and texts, any feature of a word, even its spelling, can show itself to be significant. That is, impress itself upon us as a matter of meaning. In another late essay, while reflecting on his first public defense of the ordinary, Cavell comments, if I had known the investigations, I mean, had even read it through once before writing the material in the essay, Must We Mean What We Say, I would have concentrated on, or at least wished to include in justifying Austin's procedures, along with insisting upon or instancing what it means to speak of my knowledge of my language, an equal insistence upon my attachment to my words, my experience of them and their significance to the world, hence their significance to me. That's quite a line. In this passage, Cavell seems to be distinguishing two aspects of our inhabiting language that give strength to philosophizing out of the ordinary. The first aspect of our linguistic inhabitation is our knowledge of our language, what in some early papers was presented as our transcendental knowledge of the kinds of statements we make about phenomena, grammatical knowledge, knowledge of criteria. If this were music, this first aspect of our linguistic inhabitation would be part of the system of keys, or you could say tonality, sonata form, and so on. But remembering that, as Walter Piston notes in his book, Harmony, musical theory articulates not how music will be written in the future, but how music was written in the past. Linguistic grammar, too, is investigated by looking over our shoulder. The second aspect of our linguistic inhabitation, mentioned by Cavell after the knowledge of our language, is the experience of our language, the feeling of words. It is less articulated, more sensual than the first grammatical aspect. The experience of meaning is the sort of experience which, in the following Wittgensteinian example, is strangely thin, maybe even eerie. Here is Wittgenstein's example. Suppose I had agreed on a code with someone. Tower means bank. I then tell him, go to the tower. He understands me and acts accordingly, but feels the word tower to be strange in this use. It has not absorbed the meaning. The code is cousin to one aspect of linguistic inhabitation, the one associated with knowledge, with grammar. The second aspect, which gives this unusual use of tower an eerie feeling, is the experience of meaning, the feeling of words. This feeling of words, if this feeling of words were actually music, this might be atonal. And if there were a logic of this aspect of our inhabitation of language, it might be what Deleuze referred to once as an atonal logic, interpreting Foucault. For Cavell, I suspect this experiential aspect of our linguistic inhabitation is what makes musical understanding such a good guide to linguistic understanding. Before I begin concluding, I need one more idea. Cavell's Emersonian idea of the impression, of an impression. One place this idea arrives is in another of Cavell's late essays, this one on Wallace Stevens. Cavell cautions that his idea of impression is not the familiar one from British empiricism, whose impressions were, he says, quote, predictable effects of objects upon my senses. Here is Cavell describing his different account of impression. I am interested rather, as is Emerson, in the concept of an impression as an experience that a portion of the world unpredictably gives me, in which it captures my interest, matters to me or fails to, a product of significance, not causation. Emersonian impressions are unpredictable, though I suppose they might become familiar or habitual. It is an idea of impression which almost reminds me of what William James calls pure experience. But I suspect Cavell's impressions might be just this side of pure experience, minimally impurified, more like what Foucault can call an énoncé. But back to Cavell. What are these impressions? Impressions might show themselves when the word grass, leaping free of enforced speech, speaks for itself. As it happens, that is the way Wittgenstein told his students he was tempted to speak of music. He said that to say that a theme of music expresses a musical thought would mean no more than saying it expresses itself. This musical strain, like the word grass, speaks for itself. And it is not just music that Wittgenstein speaks of in this way. When we feel each pattern of colors in different flower beds is meaningful, he tells us, we should simply say, each pattern of colors says itself. I suspect that feeling music to express itself would be an Emersonian impression. So too might be a feeling of the variegated colors of the flowers expressing themselves. So too would be the feeling of the word grass leaping free of its enforced employment. These impressions are the heart of Cavell's musical ordinary. Cavell's musical ordinary floats grammar and knowledge on a warm sea of unpredictable impressions, impressions of things, impressions of words. But if the beating heart of ordinary language philosophy is the denial that there is any third metaphysical invention that joins words and things, that secures the projection of our words into new situations, then what holds words and things together? For they do seem bound together. Sometimes it seems as if nothing could be as tightly bound as the words for things, block for block, slab for slab, tomato for tomatoes. They can seem as tightly bound as the two shells of a clam. And isn't it that binding which promises a linguistic phenomenology, that promises to reveal what a thing is by discovering what a thing is called? But how are words and things bound together? Cavell denies that there is any justification for clamming words to things, not books of rules or universals, not even the human, nothing. But if all we have are words and things, what binds them together? We know the answer. It is a matter of our sharing roots of interest and feeling, modes of response, senses of humor and of significance and of fulfillment, of what is outrageous, of what is similar to what else, what a rebuke, what forgiveness, of when an utterance is an assertion, when an appeal, and when an explanation. All the whirl of organism Wittgenstein calls forms of life. Words and things are held together by the whirl of organism Wittgenstein calls forms of life. At such a point, it seems inevitable that Cavell's philosophy would be involved with a practice of the ordinary, recalling the spiritual practices of Ado. These grammatical practices, tonal practices, would simultaneously maintain the meaning of our words and the meaning of our lives. And with the notion of an Emersonian impression in hand, we can approach the idea that the whirl of organism is a whirl of impressions stabilized by grammatical practices. A whirl of impressions stabilized by grammatical practices. That is the idea. I'm not sure how to conclude. In part, because I'm not sure what to do with the fact that those features of the whirl of organism identified in that signature passage can each of them change. What was once funny can become a microaggression. What was once outrageous can become the unremarkable presence of women on juries. What was once an unnatural act can become simply a personal choice. Some of these changes may be smooth, but others will feel as discontinuous as a Kuhnian revolution in what is taken to need or to provide explanations. Where do these changes in the whirl of organism come from? Foucault once suggested that such radical discontinuities came from a place he called simply the outside. Perhaps they do, and perhaps they can be incited by a different kind of practice, a destabling practice. I wish it were less outrageous to say that such changes come from the space between words and things, a space Thoreau's essay on walking might have called absolute freedom or wildness. It is a space revealed by agrammatical or atonal practices. Readers of Wittgenstein will recognize such agrammatical practices, for Wittgenstein introduces them, or at least their possibility, in various places, sometimes to dispel the assumption that it is rules which ground arithmetical addition, sometimes to dispel the idea that there is only one way to read a table matching color samples and their names, sometimes to dispel the idea that there is only one way to see a line figure of a triangle. Wittgenstein uses agrammatical practices, at least in part, to disturb the peace, the normal, our confident assumption that the ordinary is in some way grounded. But he does this mostly to return us peacefully home, to action without performance. This is simply what I do. I introduced atonal practices myself at the beginning when I mentioned the tree rising from the pool of gold. Approach too closely for identification. We can disempower its perfect botanical name, dissolving total intelligibility, but that is only a negative result. Up so close like that, things are broken open, releasing shards of visibility, flecks of light, sparkling colors, vanishing lines without shape. Up so close, anything can draw our affection, but it requires agrammatical practices, not only practices which close our eyes to metaphysical invention, but agrammatical practices which wake us up to the light and life in fragments of the ordinary. I'm aware of two passages where Cavell seems to dismiss the possibility of becoming absorbed in a crumpled handkerchief in the way one can become absorbed in an artistic composition. But while indeed incredulous, Cavell does not quite deny that one could become thus absorbed in a crumpled handkerchief. He does say that what is imperative is that if confronted with a person in such a putative absorption in a crumpled handkerchief, our options are either that the person is mad or on drugs or pretending, or to ask, what's in it? Given the grammatical practices Cavell encouraged, the answer to the second question is probably that there is nothing or nothing much in the crumpled handkerchief. But given atonal or agrammatical practices, would it be too extravagant to say that the putative absorption might become not mad, but a delicious musical enjoying, an agrammatical practice that warms our hearts to things? Okay, thanks. That's what I got.
Thank you very much, Gordon. Beautiful paper. Stimulating paper.
Victor, would you mind if I introduce the next speaker?
No, sure, go ahead.
Our next speaker is our master of ceremonies, Victor Krebs. This 6-month-long celebration of the life of Stanley Cavell would not have existed without Victor. And I know that Victor, in my own case, Victor, I've enjoyed participating in a number of celebrations of Stanley's work that Victor has put together. And it's been important to me. Victor got his undergraduate degree at Vanderbilt, a PhD at Notre Dame, and he is currently a professor of philosophy in the humanities department of the Pontifical Catholic University in Lima, Peru. He's written on Wittgenstein, aesthetics, Benjamin, Deleuze, and others. He has an interest in Jung's psychological theories and philosophy. He's founded the VJK Curatoria Philosophica, which is an experimental curatorial philosophical project unknown anywhere else in the world than wherever Victor is. He has written a book called Wittgenstein and Philosophy of Transcendence, The Pornographic Imagination, and forthcoming with Richard Frankel, Human Virtuality and Digital Life. And with another of the people on the screen, Bill Day, he edited Seeing Wittgenstein Anew. So that is Victor. I know we're all happy that Victor has brought us all together, and we're even happier to hear his own personal reflections today. But Victor, I don't know the title of the talk you're about to give. Can you give it? Can you recite it and then please go?
Sure. Yeah. Well, thank you very much. My original plan was certainly just to bring some extracts from my paper that I posted for you to read and say a couple more things about it. But as I was writing it, and then of course talking to Gordon about his paper, and it just all became such a bunch of issues that I ended up writing something that I didn't expect to write, that I must confess is not even quite finished. But I think that there's enough ideas here that I wanted to share with you. And the provisional title, it's as usually tentative titles are pretty ambitious. Probably does not represent most of what I'll be reading now. But here goes. It's the tentative title is Praise, Love, and Remarriage in Stanley Cavell's Thought. And I start with this little quote from Paul Franks that goes like this: "To read Cavell is, among other things, to make the discovery at once terrifying and exhilarating that the problems of philosophy and the problems of human life are all but inescapably linked." So I start with a prelude. It is only recently that I have become aware of the central importance of the notion of praise for Cavell's thinking. It is obviously central in his essays in philosophy the day after tomorrow, which he was working on when he came to Caracas at the end of the 90s. But while going through the essays in Must We Mean What We Say just recently, I noticed something I had not paid much attention to before, namely that his main rebuke to the analytic philosophers of the time was that they were not only incapable of praise, but blind to its importance. So even then, praise appeared as a concern of his. And when I read not too long ago, and little did I know, that he had lived his life, as he said, with the incessant perception or imagination of a world bent on denial, interest in it withdrawn to the point of chronic boredom, lost in lovelessness, referring, of course, to his philosophical environment, I was reminded of an interview in Venezuela where he had said that love was actually tied to the ability to praise. And then also of his claim in A Matter of Meaning It, that in these times of fraudulence and distrust, full of reactions of disgust, embarrassment, impatience, partisanship, excitement without release, silence without serenity, we are called to, quote, save love for the world until it is responsive again. My impression that praise is crucial for understanding a dimension of his work was only reinforced when I learned in some remarks from a 2002 reader's report prepared by Charles Bernstein for the University of Chicago Press that the initial title for Philosophy the Day After Tomorrow was Staging Praise, Owning Words. In other words, his concern with meaning what we say or of our being responsible for words, a main theme of his work, was set as important here as the staging of praise. What clinches the issue for me is this lucid and wrenching paragraph from A Pitch of Philosophy, where Cavell directly ties his own understanding of his task in philosophy with what he learned from the way in which what he calls his parents' lifelong romance had gone. And I quote, "They could never see reason in their despair of harmony between the inexpressiveness of his wild love, of the eloquence he would never have, and the glad unsayability of her knowledge of the utter expressiveness of music. The devastation of spirit in their quarrels and their mutual destruction of interest in the world are measures for me of arguments that must not be won, and hence of my conception of philosophy as the achievement of the unpolemical, of the refusal to take sides in metaphysical positions, of my quest to show that those are not useful sides, but needless constructions." I have, I think, from the beginning, been inclined to believe that Cavell's underlying concern with the philosophy he was opposing actually resonates with Emerson's concern for what he called the adulterous divorce between the intellect and the holy. Of course, for Cavell, the divorce is between reason and attachment, the responsibilities of implication and the rights of desire. I would claim that he is securing the conditions where an eventual remarriage is possible, not, however, as he himself explained, to reconcile two opposing positions, but for the halves of the mind to go back together. Trying to see reason in our despair of harmony would be nothing other than an achievement of acknowledgement, or an instance of the kind of love we must preserve for the world until it is responsive again. Section 1 is called Passionate Creatures. Austin's appeal to ordinary language and Wittgenstein's returning words to their everyday use both teach us to think from under our feet rather than above our heads, from the ethereal realms of the mind to the fleshy opaqueness of the body, from metaphysics to our everyday talk. They have indeed the effect of bringing our words closer to the body, to making language, as Wittgenstein says, a spatial-temporal phenomenon. They discard abstract constructs like propositions in favor of our concrete linguistic interactions, our existential connection by means of our words and in the forms of life we share to the world and others. In his performative utterances, Austin had represented us as engaged with one another through our verbal commitments, essentially as promising creatures. For Cavell, however, we are much more than merely promising creatures. His extension of Austin's performatives into passionate utterance makes evident that for him, we're also, and perhaps primarily, beings of passion, poetic, musical, tragic. Our debt to words is then not just that of honesty and truthfulness, as it is with a simple promise. It is not just the accomplishment of the laws of speech, not just the accordance with convention and social agreements that is required, but also a dealing with what Cavell so appropriately calls the rights of desire. With words, we're existentially, erotically committed. Austin had opened the door for reconciling propositional language with expression and performance. He had cast a glance at the disorder of desire underlying speech, but in proposing a theory of language that rescues that dimension of speech and yet takes the expression of desire as merely incidental, is symptomatic of the very prejudices that make of him, as Stanley says, an Enlightenment character, committed to all that is overdone or misdirected in its goals or rationality that Cavell wants to leave behind. As he puts it, in every moment and beyond any measure recognizable to us, we are affecting others and ourselves with our words, and therefore with our silence, drawing